Cragle, General Counsel here at RREAF Holdings. Good to have you all with us again today. A few more weeks of this. See, next week is property management. I'm going to talk about top 10 problems in property management. And then there's still some discussion about what we're going to do the last week. I think that's the 12th, Friday the 12th, you guys last week. I was going to do this presentation that last week. Usually don't want to talk about problems till we get to the end, right, and how we fix them. But because of some schedule conflicts with other presenters, I thought, well, I'll do this one today. So this might be a little shorter than my usual, but as you'll see, I start out with, like I usually try to anyway, a quote from a fairly famous book of sorts. This is one translation of it. There have been a lot of translations of The Art of War done over the years. Textually, we're missing what we believe we're missing significant pieces of, the original, well, not the original manuscripts, but the writing as it was originally done. There seem to be some significant holes in some of the writing, but it's really great stuff. And if you've not read it before, it's not. This looks like it's really long, but it's not. This is a presentation copy, double thick pages with like a single paragraph on one side, and then the Chinese on the Chinese on the other side. So if you could read the Chinese, you could read it in original, and then this is the translator's translation into English. And there are notes at the bottom that generally indicate, kind of how he's viewed the translation and that sort of thing. But it really is a great book if what you're interested in is finding a whole lot out about business and how business gets done. There's a lot of truth in the art of war that can be applied to business, not just combat. In some respects, business is a bit of combat, is it not? On a lot of different fronts, which is one of the reasons that it's so important for us to get to this subject matter today, and that is the things we miss, and then what we do about them to fix them. So I threw together, this is a list that sort of runs around in my head and not necessarily organized quite in the fashion that it is here. This is a bit more organized than what goes on in my head from day to day. But let's run down through some of these things so you can see the sort of wide range of issues that we have to deal with. And then we'll go through and talk briefly on each one about maybe how we go about dealing with that particular kind of issue. And you'll see on the back side, on the second page of the handout, there's a listing of kind of process that we go through when we have to fix things. So Sun Tzu, a wise leader, considers both advantages and disadvantages equally. It's said that the Chinese word for crisis is the character is the same character that gets used for the word opportunity. Crisis and opportunity are similar facets of the same coin, or opposite facets, really, of the same coin, and looked at in that kind of way. And Chinese tends to be that way in very many ways. There are sort of opposing doctrines in the way Chinese characters are set up and the way the Chinese reads. So it's very story-oriented and concept-oriented in the language. And so this is an important example of how someone would be thinking that the leader is going to consider both advantages and disadvantages equally. In other words, one is not better than the other. And it's important for us in business to see things from that perspective exactly. What appears to be a disadvantage may give us an opportunity to solve an issue in a unique way that opens doors for us that otherwise may not be open. And we've done that here at RREAF in a number of situations where it looked like, because of changes in law or other things, it was going to be extremely difficult for us to get deals done, and yet we were able to find new ways of thinking through an issue that looked like it was a disadvantage that other people were struggling with, and find ways then to work with that disadvantage and turn it into an advantage. Because as long as there are disadvantages that other people are having a hard time getting through, if you can find a way to get through it, it becomes an operating advantage for you, a competitive advantage actually for you. So don't see disadvantages necessarily as being impediments to getting things done. See them as obstacles that can be worked through creatively. And in order to do that, you'll usually follow about the things that we'll talk about on the back. And again, I just worked this through in my head about how we handle our issues here. When I worked through those 13 items, there probably could be 20 or 30 or 50 different items on that list on the back about how we go about fixing an issue or a problem that stands before us, whether it's on the early end of a deal or somewhere in the middle of the deal or at the end of the deal. And we run into issues all the time, right? It's the other thing that's worthwhile mentioning up front here as we get into context, and you guys know how I am about context. I think context is everything. You need to understand how to read the question by knowing the context in which that question or that issue is being presented to you, right? Without context, there's no way to know what you do with it or what you should be doing with it. So, I mean, it's already difficult enough dealing with business in our environments and decision-making in conditions of uncertainty, which those of you who are in economics and finance, you talk about that all the time. Risk-taking under conditions of uncertainty, right? That is business 101. It's what we do every single day in business. So we've got to figure out how do we, in some cases in finance and in economics, we try to figure out how to quantify some of that and turn it into equational metrics. In finance, we talk about risk-adjusted discount rates and fancy terms like that, right? That sound really great when you're sitting there in a classroom and you're studying it in a book and you have to regurgitate it on a test or that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, you have to come back to the question of, okay, if I'm going to talk about a risk-adjusted discount rate, just a second. How do I know what that rate is? How do I know what risk what adjustment I should make to the discount rate to appropriate the risk? How do I know that? This is not some magical sort of, okay, well, I can just plug it into a computer and it comes out the other side, right? It takes business acumen. It takes experience. It takes the art of war. It takes the ability to see it happening on the ground right in front of you, see the issue, have enough perspective to see the issue, and then know what your alternatives are over here that nobody else is thinking about, or what we should be thinking about that we may not even know about, which gets us into another issue and how we solve these kinds of problems in the list. But again, the point is, these are complex problems, multifaceted, multi-market issues that we're typically dealing with. So don't oversimplify these things. They're incredibly complicated. It's, again, not unlike war. You can assume something's going to happen and completely miss it. And missing the smallest thing, and there's entire studies on this. I mean, the disaster with the Columbia is an example that we now know as a result of long study after the Columbia disaster that was completely avoidable. That disaster was completely avoidable. But what had happened over a very long period of time in those processes, in the scientific processes that were involved in manufacturing and other things, people were just disregarding small things, small evidences of an issue that then, because we didn't have enough detail and couldn't really dig into it at the point of exit with the Columbia, we thought there might be a problem, but we weren't sure until it came back into to reentry, and the whole thing came apart. The point is, we now know from the study that had quality control and those who were involved in that particular area where the problem ended up being raised these issues early on as part of the manufacturing process and the delivery process, the development process, the issue would have been addressed. So these are process issues, and Jeff Holzman, our Chief Operating Officer, is a master and an expert at process. And in fact, it's one of the reasons we have a continually changing and growing policy manual, because it teaches, we learn from our lessons, which is another one of the things we'll talk about. We learn from our lessons, we go back and review them, analyze them, figure out what went wrong in the process, and then add to it and continue to adjust by it. And the only way we can do that is have an environment where we're never okay with mistake and failure, but we creatively and actively promote problem solving here in ways that productively answer issues, whether they happen early in a deal, in the middle of a deal, or toward the end of a deal, or even post-deal, so that we can deal with it. So you'll find as we talk through this that a lot of this problem area tends to devolve then upon how do we deal with it, which we'll get to in the second part of this. So let's talk through some of the issues that we tend to see, and I tried to stay in probably wide categories because it's easier to stay in wider categories in deals. And I think, by the way, you'll find that this isn't just true, and I've tried to take this, this detail from my wider experience in business and in law practice, commercial law practice for the last 35 years, not just in the last 5 here at RREAF Holdings. So this is a much wider sort of view. But these certainly are things that come up in virtually every one of our deals. Not that we miss them, but they are details that we pay attention to and make sure that the process works in. So let's just go through them one at a time. And as we go along here, guys, if we have, and we've been together a few times, if there are specific things you think of or questions you have on a particular category of item, or you'd like to talk about it a little bit, just raise it. Let's just talk about them, okay? So the first main issue that I see, and this is really standing back from a deal at the beginning of the deal and looking at it from a very wide view, as I have sometimes said to you guys in the past, the 50,000-foot view, okay? I would refer to these as strategic issues. So it's important for us to step back away from every deal when we look at it and say, okay, how does this fit into not only the company's portfolio or vision or view, but how is this deal going to fit into the world? That is, where does it fit in the world of commerce, in the world of this particular market, in the world of the various competitors, suppliers, and the like, and begin to look at where does it fit in the legal environment. Is it a special industry, for example, that has special regulatory stuff associated with it? Does that mean that competitors who are more tuned into that kind of detail will be more likely to have a competitive advantage? And do we need to be thinking about that, right? So these are more strategic issues that you want to look at up front and ask yourself a whole bunch of questions about. And if you need to, and generally we do need to, this is sort of one of those answers on the back, go obtain qualified advisors. So before we ever even get to a problem to fix it, let's recognize we've got strategic issues up front. Let's make sure we do number 5 and on the back, and that is go get qualified advisors in every one of those areas. So, I've listed in just my narrative under strategic issues number 1, this notion of global warming. You don't need to listen to me very long to hear me say something about global warming, but I'm not necessarily a global warming proponent. But acknowledge that weather events in general have an effect on business, right? I mean, they have since before we started talking about global warming. We got flooding, we got earthquakes, we got lots of different things, right? Hurricanes, we deal in our portfolio, we deal with hurricanes regularly, right? But let's talk about global warming for a second. One of the things that came up in global warming that fairly recently, I don't remember what it was, in the last year, let's put it that way, the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, came out with a study that said that given current temperature rises on the face of the planet, we could expect mean ocean levels to rise significantly enough that in most of the coastal cities along the United States shoreline, we would see coastal flooding increase significantly at mean high tide events by 2050. And I don't know that I'll be around for that, but you guys probably will be, and your children will be, okay? So I raise that as simply an issue that, when you're reading this sort of stuff, let these kinds of things stick in the back of your head and ask yourself whether that is a strategic issue in the future. You're talking about coastal real estate? My guess it's probably a strategic issue, something you ought to be giving some thought to. Now, 20 years from now, the NOAA may come out with a completely different report that says, oh, no, we don't have that issue anymore. But I'm simply trying to raise the issue with you that it's these sort of off-the-grid kind of things that most people aren't walking around thinking about, that as business people and as advisors in our areas, we need to get outside of the thing we do every single day, because it's easy to get lost in the detail of what happens in our business practice on a daily basis and just continue to chase the things that we chase and do the things we know, right? We get comfortable. We all get comfortable with it. We get comfortable doing the things we know how to do. We feel accomplished and proud of doing it. It's great. And off we go into it, right? And we kind of stick with it. It's really, really important that you get outside of that. And this strategic issues point is an important one. I'd recommend highly that you have a look at it. I had a lawyer tell me a couple of days ago, and I'll finish this point with this story. I had a lawyer tell me a couple of days ago that he was writing an offering memorandum in a project involving a freshwater lake marina. That a big chunk of real estate was being bought out of bankruptcy, and it was on a big lakeside, and one developer was buying all the property, but they didn't want the marina. And so his client was putting together a marina deal to buy the marina and then turn it, into a standalone business. And they were going out with an offering to raise capital for the marina. And he was strategic enough and wide enough in his thinking at that point that because it was a lake and it was in a series of lakes, he decided to put as a risk factor in the private offering memorandum that under the right conditions, it was possible that the water level of the lake could come down enough that the marina's business would be unable to continue. That was possible. He put that in there, right? Possible. A year and a half later, the place went through such a drought that the lake level dropped to the point where apparently there were actually scuba guys who had been lost and never recovered. They couldn't find, who had died a number of years ago, that they found stuck in way down below the level where the water was, in either the docks or the trees that were embedded under the water or those sorts of things. My point is, he was right to get outside of the usual thinking and be aware that there could be something else, no matter how catastrophic, that could happen. So, again, strategic issues. Get wide in your thinking, even if it's way outside the box. Relationship issues. Every business is based on relationship, one way or the other. So recognize when you get into business deals that relationship issues can both be strengths, as Sun Tzu would have us, advantages and disadvantages. We can see relationships changing over time that we thought were key supplier relationships or key customer relationships that change over time that could materially impact the success or failure of the project. So remember to look hard at key relationships when you're involved in the project, especially early on when you're in the diligence phase. Obviously that's important, but managing those relationships, maintaining them, seeing them as they change. What our key suppliers at one point could be replaced by another supplier, or that key supplier could be taken over by another business, And because of the relationships that that other business has with other of your competitors could completely effectively go away. So just recognize that relationships are also another strategic area that can go wrong that we really need to pay attention to. Deal details, obvious one, right? Details of the deal. Making sure that we get the deal details right when we negotiate them, that we do some not only strategic thinking and relationship thinking, but interdisciplinary thinking about how the deal details are going to work, not just in the obvious areas, but in ancillary areas that we may not be thinking about and the effects that they may have on them. Just remember those deal details, sorry, a little difficult to say that, double D, that deal details are can come back to get you at any point in the deal. And what tends to happen, at least my experience in it, has been that it tends to be that we're paying attention to the really big material items when we're negotiating the deal points. And because we're so focused on those larger issues, we'll fail to see some things that appeared to be less significant, but that actually turn out to be fairly significant turning items in the deal at some point, whether before we get to closing or after closing. So don't dismiss even what appear to be kind of the smallest details. Don't just dismiss them and overlook them when you're doing a deal. Remember, those details are critical. You know, you guys have heard me say, the devil is in the detail. It is in the detail. You need to see the strategic big picture because you'll miss some things if you don't see that first. But then you have to be willing to roll your sleeves up and dig down into the detail. Make sure you get it right, track it right, pay attention to it, right? And I notice, I note a few things there. For example, structure, deal structure, taxation planning, lending requirements, both before and after the deal. These are all deal details that can be really, really important. After you've found yourself in the deal, you own the business, and now you're off and running. So pay attention to that all ahead of time. Ask yourself when you're negotiating a deal, what's this going to look like after we've closed? What do I want it to look like? What's happening right now that's not the way I want it? If it were my business, I would not want it the way it's running right now, or not have to deal with some of the issues they're dealing with right now. And how am I going to deal with those? How am I going to make those work in light of all the other things that I know I'm learning are going on in that business? Ask those questions. Documentary failures. Okay, right. You're now in the middle of our wheelhouse down at legal. It's critical that we take all this hard work that the deal makers do up front, getting all of the strategic issues solved and the relationship issues handled and the deal details, working all that out. It's critical that we translate all of that somehow or another into the deal documents so that they not only make sense to us, but they will make sense at some point in the future if, God help us, a court has to read them and decide whether we got those right or not, or whether the parties begin to diverge in their view of what's happened and go back to the documents to look at what rights they have, which happens from time to time in our deals. We hope that we do our deal documents, they're finished, we put them in a drawer. As one of my younger brothers said a long time ago, we put that deal document in a drawer and it gets yellow for the next 30 years and we never look at it again. What a beautiful deal that is, right? Just remember, translating our deals into appropriate documents is a difficult and time-consuming task. It's one that requires absolute attention to detail all the time. And any one change, and this is the other thing that happens in these situations, and we see it happen, any one change in a document can have a collateral effect on a whole series of other documents or rights under other documents. So it's easy to think, oh yeah, well that clause up in the document, that needs to change, and then not go back and stand back and ask, wait, what is that going to mean to the rest of the deal or the like? Now sometimes it's not, that's not a difficult question. It is just isolated to that one provision. but really ask yourself questions carefully when you start making adjustments in documents. And I would encourage you, any of you, I mean, irrespective of whether any of you ever went into the practice of law or not, get in the habit of reading the deal documents you're going to get into. Just get in the habit of reading them. Most people don't like to read. It's one of the things that I find in law practice today. People don't like to read. They just don't like to read. And they sure don't like to write. Well, it's one of the reasons we do what we do. But believe me, it's important that the client understand what that document says. And we get those calls downstairs all the time. Asset managers will call and ask us, okay, what did you guys mean by this when you wrote this? What are we supposed to do with this? And sometimes we have to call counsel on the other side and make an adjustment to the language or those sorts of things. But don't shirk your responsibility as a deal maker or a deal manager to read the documents that your deal's going to have to live under, with, and in. Just get into it. I mean, it's a lost art, and sadly one of those things that as I watch it happen these days, I'm not happy with it. I mean, I'm unhappy about the notion that people are not reading the documents anymore. So we try to make sure that we get the details right in the documents. Sometimes we miss them. We'll talk about what we do when that happens. Sometimes, but I shouldn't say that. It's not sometimes. All the time. Deal terms are changing almost constantly, all the way to closing. Some of them are less significant. They're more sort of detailed items, right? You're constantly negotiating deal details, almost all the way to closing in most cases. We find out things in due diligence, and so we need to make an adjustment. So that's the other reason it's important for us to pay attention to the documents. We may need to make adjustments to the documents as we get going that direction. So we're going to get to another point here next that is critical, really critical, and that is we can't get documents right unless we communicate well. Communication failures are critical, mission-critical failures in every deal. Our ability or inability to communicate clearly, directly, and in a timely fashion is absolutely mission-critical to what you'll do in every deal you ever do, whether it's here at RREAF or elsewhere. Now, we have means of communication. We use email, we use text messages, we use phone calls, we use Teams calls and all those sorts of things. Try to keep everybody up to speed. But these communications protocols that we live by and that we work through are critical means by which those of you who are in deal making communicate to those who are in deal documenting, deal management, operations, projections, accounting, all those sorts of things. All of these functions all are interrelated and they all work together. Our ability or inability to communicate well and efficiently is critical. And we see failures in communication probably more often than we see any of these other failures on this list of failure items. So we have communications protocols here. Again, in the policy manual, we continue to work on communication and communication protocols during and after deals to try to get them, make them better, make them not only more efficient, but make them cover appropriate ground without overloading people who are involved in the processes. Diligence failures, we see obviously when we're getting ready to acquire a deal or we're in the process of acquiring a deal, diligence is incredibly important. And in fact, it's probably the most important thing we do in every deal. And our ability to get into and get through diligence is critical. And there's an entire team of people that handle diligence. There are folks in underwriting, there are folks in management and property management, folks in legal. There are a lot of different disciplines that are looking at diligence. And diligence, every detail of diligence ends up in the business models, in the projections, in the estimates of what kind of liabilities or risks there will be, as well as the possible benefits, how well the business or how long the business will run, what that revenue tail will look like, all of that sort of stuff. So again, it's like reading deal documents. Don't skip the details and certainly don't skip the details during the diligence process. But a third party raised the issue when we got to closing. And it was a critical third party. We said, no, we've looked at this. And they, that particular party had negotiating leverage and power, and so we've got to deal with the issue. So I'm just saying, misinterpretations, no matter how much diligence you've done, misinterpretations of that information can also create issues that then need to be dealt with. Execution failures. So failure to deliver the things that need to be done to complete a deal, to finish it. Even if you got all the rest of it right and you failed to deliver it. Failure to deliver it accurately, which would get back to documentary failures if it was a lawyer sort of thing. But it also might be communication failure. Failure to deliver communication accurately in a way that will that transitions from buying to operation, right? So there's lots of that also, or lots of opportunities for that as well. Timing failures, another category, wide category. Timing failures are obviously important. We deal with closing deadlines, for example, the obvious one, closing deadlines. But there are other deadlines. Some of them established in documents and some of them in statutes, for example. In litigation, we deal with the issue of having to answer. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of litigation, but when we do, you have to answer that lawsuit. Well, there are specific timelines for that, deadlines, and they have to be met. And the same thing would be true of discovery and a whole bunch of other things. That's just an example, an easy example for a lawyer of a deadline that just has to be met. And it's got to be calendared, and somebody needs to be dealing with it. Resources need to be applied, and it needs to be dealt with. We have the same thing in all of our acquisitions. We have deadlines. We'll have extension deadlines for diligence periods, for example. These are the easy ones. Extension deadlines for to put up additional earnest money, right? A deadline for that. If we miss it by a day, maybe the seller could say, nope, not doing it. We're not accepting it. We're out. See ya. Bye. Right? We have to pay attention to deadlines. So deadline failures, timing failures, let me put it that way, wider category. Timing failures are another failure that we see from time to time. We don't ever want to see, but certainly things that need to be addressed. And as I note in my notation, they can be deal level, they can be like in a PSA, they can be related to equity, they could be related to debt, or operational transition matters. There may be transitional details, deadlines that need to be met. So, for example, bonds that need to be transferred over, or other things that happen post-closing, there are deadlines for those. And we need to pay attention to those. So timing failures, important. And then lastly, what I refer to as expertise failures. That is simply not having the right expertise on the team to be able to properly analyze and deliver the right result, if there is one. Again, complex matters that are moving around all the time. We can't predict outcomes. Generally, we try to, but we do our best. Again, risk decision-making in conditions of uncertainty, what we do every single day. But the bottom line is we've got expertise. We shouldn't be failing because of expertise failures. Expertise is something that we can get a hold of. We can find people who are experts in particular areas if we need those areas, and deploy them in the way we need so that we get the right answers, so that from a diligence perspective or a deal perspective, we can have a bit more certainty in that area, a bit more anyway, and then make rational business decisions around that bit more uncertainty. So now, now that we've kind of been through my 10 categories of, and by the way, that was completely unintentional. It just happened that way. There's probably 35 more categories, for all I know. Hold on for a second. Yeah, so we've got about 10 minutes or so left. I'd like to take just to run down through how do we fix these things? How do you fix an issue when it arises in front of you, whether it's early on in the deal, in the LOI process, or you haven't even made a deal yet. You're trying to fix this problem, whether you've actually signed up the LOI and you're off into a definitive agreement drafting and negotiation of finer points, finer details, or you're on into the contract and you're in the diligence period and you're headed toward a closing, or even post-closing. How do we deal with these failures if they come up? And I think categorically we can use this kind of process that I've laid out here. And by the way, you can probably use this in just about every issue you face in your life. It's really just simple problem solving and then adjustment along the way. Sun Tzu says something else in The Art of War that I thought, I took the tab out, but I'm going to make his point. Military strategy is like water, which flows away from high ground to low ground. And he goes on to talk very briefly about the analogy to water, and that is decision-making in conditions of uncertainty, whether it's in combat or in business, require us to be able to flow around the topography like water does. Adjust. What he's trying to say to us is we need to be able to adjust as we go. Now, adjusting sounds easy, but it's really hard because it requires expertise. It requires lots of experience, which is why first thing you do when you encounter a problem that you didn't expect to have, I've said this for a number of years, including to some of my younger brothers. Take 3 really deep breaths. Start with some deep breaths, because it's easy in the midst of a conflict or a challenge to all of a sudden jump into fix-it mode and get after it. Whoa, hold on, back up. Take some deep breaths. Turn away from it. Try to get your mind clear. Don't let it run. Try to get your mind clear first. And when you feel like you've cleared that, then turn back to it and ask, okay, what's the real issue? What's the real issue? Can you dive down into it, right? So, and part of that, we're going to get into on death and dying and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross here as a part of this precursor to what do I do about it, is take stock. Take some deep breaths, first of all, and then take stock. Recognize the failure. See what it actually is, what the real failure is, and then acknowledge it. Acknowledge that failure. And number 3, take responsibility for it. Forget the blame game. The blame game at that point doesn't work. It never works in an organization. Never works. We can't solve a problem with blame game, right? What we have to do is get our minds clear, focus on the real issue, and then begin to ask, how can we do this? Take responsibility for it and be prepared to say, okay, messed that one up. We missed that one. I missed that one. Now, what are we going to do? What do we do? All right. So, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on Death and Dying says there are 5 stages of recovery in the grief process. And so think of a failure in business as a grief process, a death, so to speak, okay? She said, first of all, you have denial. Oh, no, I didn't do that. That's not my fault. I didn't do that, right? Natural reaction. Second, anger. Hey, why did that happen, right? You get angry, right? Your adrenaline level's now rising, fight or flight turns on, all kinds of things happen. Then we begin to bargain. Oh, no, I know, but look, but I can do this. I can do this, right? Bargaining, okay? And then depression. You go home finally, you go, oh my God, I can't, what am I going to do now, right? And then finally, ultimately, acceptance. Okay, this one's on me. I got this. Now, mind clear, as clear as I can get it. Now what do I do? What do we do to make this go? What do we do to make this right? So take responsibility actively. Then 4, obviously, first, what you would think is the first step anytime you see a problem, and that is seek to objectively assess the problem, right? Assess the problem. But I use the word objectively importantly there, and only after you've come to terms with it. Don't try to assess the problem until you've come to terms with it. Once you come to terms with it, then you're sort of freed up emotionally and intellectually sort of say, okay, I'm not going to try to find a way to avoid this. The question is, if this was a brand new problem in front of me, if a professor had thrown this in front of me right, and said, solve that, what would I do? Right? Now I try to divest myself of my personal emotion in it and start to walk myself through the problem-solving sequence. So seek to objectively assess it. And in doing that, by the way, recognizing that there are very few constants, constantly be willing to creatively see the problem, creatively see it as you're assessing it. Don't just try to see it in one particular way. Try to see it from a number of different sides. And if I could share more from Sun Tzu in The Art of War, he talks about doing that in every battle situation. Seeing it from a number of different perspectives before you begin to think you should go one direction versus the other. Right? It's important to see it from a number of different perspectives. And then fifth, I've mentioned it before, obtain qualified advisors. Obviously, you've got a problem that, unless it was simply an oversight, a documentary oversight, for example, in a documentary failure, item number 4, for example. Unless it's just that, and all we're trying to do is fix something that's incorrect in a document. If you have a larger problem, you need to go get qualified advisors. Find the right people. Don't try to do this on your own, right? Find the right people to help out. Get them on a team. Get them in a room. Get them on a conference call, whatever it is these days. We don't get in rooms anymore. Get them on a call. Get them on a Teams and talk through the issue. And it should be multidisciplinary people that will see this thing from a different perspective than yours. Don't just call more people like you. That doesn't work, right? Doesn't work. So obtain qualified advisors. Next, obtain and review all the relevant information and query what the current state of affairs is, the details. And again, back to Sun Tzu, from the general to the specific. Don't dive down into the details first. Start from the general and understand it well, and then dig down into the details as you go till you get to what seems to be the genesis of the issue. Okay? Then develop a range of possible fixes and solutions, not just one. Develop a range of them in light of the various multidisciplinary expertises that are sitting around the table. So you bring asset management in, you bring underwriting in, you bring accounting in, you bring tax in, you sit down and you talk about it, because we may come up with 3 different ways to deal with that problem, any one of which could have benefits one direction and some detriments the other direction, and management will need to make a decision about which one of those benefits and detriments packages they want to take on in that particular situation. So develop a range of alternatives. Obviously, next, management's going to choose the best alternative, and then you need to devise a plan to implement it once you've decided. And that's going to depend on the solution set that gets decided on, right? Then execute the implementation, pretty straightforward stuff now. And then I would suggest to you that just as we've tried to be wide in our view of objectively assessing by getting a number of different lines of thinking involved in the assessment process, I'd recommend to you that item 11 is just as important. And that is, even though you're executing implementation, review and adjust the implementation as needed to completion. And that is going to require the involvement of experts that have helped put this together. Adjustment along the way is going to require expertise. It's very rare for a fix to just go as originally planned, at least if it's a significant problem. It's a simple problem, fairly straightforward fixes generally. But if it's a significant problem, remember, you'll need to regather again and continue to assess and make sure that the implementation and execution are working the way you intended them to do when you put the plan together. And then post-completion, one of the things I think Jeff does a great job of here is review failure, review the failure, and then implement whatever organizational changes or policy changes are needed so that we've learned from that failure, we've documented it. I call it institutionalizing. institutionalizing the knowledge, the company's knowledge, institutionalizing it into our procedures manual and learn from it. And then, and that's really 12 and 13. 12 is the review part, and 13 is addressing it in longer term policy, statements or processes, procedures, checklists, whatever it is that will help us learn from it so that we don't have that issue again, or we'll see it the next time, this time much earlier in the process rather than later, right? When it gets discovered. So that is, those are my thoughts on the things we miss and how we fix them. And I appreciate you guys' attention again today. Anybody have any thoughts, war stories, things like that? Anybody have any admissions about what you've missed and how you fixed them? No, you've never missed anything? I got it. Understood. Yeah. Well, I was going to say you all are young, but I'm young too. So I've got a lifetime of misses ahead of me. Yeah. So I'm sure I'll have plenty of opportunities to fix them. But I really appreciate your attention. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure and an honor to speak with you, and look forward to the next time.